Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. In today's video, we're going to talk about this lens. This is Nikon's 800mm 6.3 Z-mount lens. It is a great value. I'm going to let you know, is this the greatest value in wildlife lenses that I've ever shot? I'm also going to let you know, if you're interested in this lens, who is this lens specifically for? And we'll get to it right after this. Now in today's video, I'm talking about this 800mm lens from Nikon. I've been very, very curious, and B&H has been wonderful to me. They sent me this. I want to thank Abe Kurland, who's one of my contacts over at B&H. He's been absolutely wonderful. And using this for the last 30 days has been a joy because I was just super, super curious. One thing about where we're at in the progression of Nikon mirrorless lenses is they've added quite a few wildlife options. We start, kind of in that 400mm range, and we get up now into the 800mm range, and there's all kinds of lenses in between. You're going to see two here. This is my personal lens. This is my 400 2.8, and we're going to compare a little bit of this lens, this 800 6.3. I love comparisons. We're going to compare this one to what my lens looks like with a 2x teleconverter on it. So essentially an 800 5.6. I'm going to compare it directly with this in terms of sharpness and quality and how much of a difference it made. Now, on this channel, I try to be extremely practical. And in fact, I want you to know me as the practical wildlife shooter that doesn't just dig into minutia and details, but really tries to give you the practical applications. Who's it for? How does it perform in the field? Does it make a difference? And what about value? And that's really where I see this lens standing out against all of its competition. So let's start just with the history of the 800mm lenses for Nikon. Back in the F-mount days, they made an 800mm 5.6. It came out around $20,000. To buy that lens today, I think you're still looking at $16,000 to $17,000 for an 800 5.6. At 1/3 of a stop less, this lens is $10,000 cheaper than its F-mount predecessor. Now, right on paper, that looks pretty wild. Couple other things about this. The original lens, the F-mount lens, focused down to 20 feet, and it weighed 10 pounds. This lens weighs 5 pounds and has a minimum focusing distance of 16 feet. So, we're going to talk a lot about these two factors with this lens, aperture and minimum focus distance, and really how those things separate it from some of the other lenses in its lineup. Now, I am going to deal with sharpness because I know every wildlife photographer cares about sharpness. I will throw this out there. I am not consumed by finding the sharpest lens on paper. What I do want to know is, when I take a wildlife image, for me specifically a bird image, is this lens sharp enough to do the job? And I will tell you, just up front, every lens I've tested from Nikon, the 400 series, the 100 to 400, the 400 4.5, my 400 2.8, and now this 800 6.3, everyone passes that test. There may be very, very small differences in sharpness, but most of them will only be seen when magnified at 200%, and to the human eye, most of them are not going to be seen. So I don't want to diminish a lens in terms of its ability to be sharp. I don't want to say that's not important. What I do want to say is that sometimes people get a little hyper-focused on charts and details, and some of that can't be seen by the human eye at normal distances. So just putting that out there. I'll tell you right up front, this lens is plenty sharp. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. Before I get into that, let me just run through the lens. I'm going to compare it specifically to my lens. Very small differences in this. So over on the side, we've got a couple function buttons, just like we do with almost all of the prime lenses here. Auto and manual button or slide. And then one more slide here that goes from full, and it's got what's called a focus limiter. That really speeds up the lens when you're not shooting subjects within this first, in this case, 16 to 30 feet. You can put on a focus limiter. It will allow faster focusing as the lens doesn't travel all the way through its gamut of focusing options. There's a little filter drop in up here. The focusing ring, of course, we've got 4 control buttons. These are programmable. All of these 4 will do the same. I flip it around to the other side. I see this memory set button. So I can set it here at a specific focusing distance and then use these buttons on the bottom to recall. And then Nikon includes a couple of rings on their newer lenses. And if I get the terminology, I'll fix it down there because sometimes I get them mixed up. This is, of course, the focusing ring. They've also got a control ring. Now that is on my f2.8, so it's got a third ring down here. And then I believe we're calling this on Nikon now the function ring. So this little ring right here, that can be changed or set to deal with things like aperture or exposure compensation. So some nice options on this lens. Pretty standard on what you're getting on Nikon's wildlife prime lenses though. So that's kind of the setup and the way it looks. I did mention some of the specs, but let me put them up on the screen. And I'm actually gonna show you how this compares to some of the other lenses in this realm. So this one's gonna come in at around $6,500. Minimum aperture 6.3, 5 pounds as I mentioned, minimum focus 16, and I've got this maximum magnification. This is how large the image will appear on the sensor based off of the lens you're using. The larger that number, so if it's 0.2 or 1 to 5, that's the ratio 1 to 5, it will appear 1/5 as large as it does in real life on the actual sensor. The larger that number, the more magnification you get. Now in wildlife lenses, it's very typical to be somewhere between like 0.12 and maybe 0.2. Like that's kind of the range. So these at 0.16, very, very common of the magnification ratio you're going to get from most wildlife lenses. Now I'm going to add a couple other lenses in here. So I've added another Nikon lens. This is the 600 6.3. And I wanted to compare that because I do think there's an audience out there that's going to say, one of these lenses might be for me. Both of these lenses under $10,000, actually under $7,000, there might be a budget for a lot of people looking in this range. So maybe you're not stepping up to this 600 f4, which is going to run you close to $15,000, or this 400 2.8, which is approaching $15,000. This is kind of a sweet spot for a lot of wildlife photographers who are starting to get serious. They're willing to invest a few $1,000s in a lens, but really don't want to make that commitment of tens of thousands of dollars. So this one falls at $6,500. The 600 6.3 doesn't offer a lot of advantages in terms of the glass. So the magnification ratio is about the same. You can get a little closer, so you can get to 13 feet, but it's a shorter focal length, so you don't get as much magnification from that length. It also doesn't reduce the aperture. So as I've stepped down from 800 to 600, I've kept the aperture consistent at 6.3. So what is the advantage? If this one seems to have a lot of advantages, well, one advantage is its price. The 600 6.3 is going to be about $1,500 cheaper, and it will do the job for most people. The second thing is it's extremely light. So at 3 pounds, that is almost unheard of for a 600 millimeter lens these days, a prime lens. So really, really light. This is part of that PF series, very, very light lens. So those are the two, I'm going to call these mid-level lenses based in their lineup. And then you can see a couple stats down here for my lens. My lens has a minimum focus of 8 feet, and you can see the initial magnification ratio. The advantage of this, this faster lens, this 400 2.8 lens, is that when you add teleconverters, you don't lose the minimum focus distance. So you stay at 8 feet when you're at minimum focus, but you add magnification. And you can see how that affects the magnification ratio over there. So you go from a 1.7 down to a 0.3 or a 0.17 to a 0.34. That's actually pretty significant if you're shooting at 800 millimeters with the teleconverters. So those are some of the basic specs. Again, comparing this to my 400 and then also one other lens that's in that price range. I didn't include the 600 f4 in this review. It is much more comparable to the 400, but I did want to show you the difference in magnification when you use a 400 millimeter 2.8 with those teleconverters. Now, let's get into everybody's favorite subject, sharpness. Now, to give you an idea of what this lens actually looks like, I did a controlled test for sharpness because I really wanted to compare apples to apples. I'm going to use two different lenses here, and I started with the 800 6.3. I'll zoom in close so you can get a look at this. This is at its minimum focus. So this is right around that 16-foot range. And this subject is about 4 or 5 inches tall. It's just a little bird that I bought off of, I think I bought it off of Etsy from somebody who makes these. Now, let's look at some of the details. I know at this range on YouTube, you might not be able to see it, so I'm going to just go into 100%. And we'll get into some of these details right around the feathers and eyes, because that's what most people care about for bird photography. If you're a mammal photographer, again, you're looking at eyes and fur typically for sharpness. You could see at this view, very, very, very sharp. You get all the feather details. You can see really, really nice detail on the eye. That catch light, one of the ways to really hyper focus on sharpness for a lens without using test charts, but in the field, is look at that catch light. And when it's really pinpoint and small, you'll tend to know that that lens is very, very sharp. When the catch light, when it's perfectly in focus, if it's a little soft at all, it's a pretty good indicator that the lens is softer. So we'll look at that catch light in just a second. Now, at 100%, let's compare that to my 400 2.8 with a teleconverter. And you tell me which one looks sharper just right here. All right, so that's the 400 2.8. I want you to look at two areas, the eye and the back of the white feathers on the head. And then this one. Now, at first glance, my 400 2.8 with teleconverter looked a little sharper, but I think there's a hair of focus difference, just a hair, because when I got onto the eye, it looked a little different. Now, to show you that, I'll probably have to go in a little closer. So let's get in here. This is the 800 millimeter 6.3, and then this is the 800 millimeter 5.6, or the 400 with a teleconverter. You see the difference in the eye? You see that? I told you that catch light is a pretty good indicator of sharpness. Boy, both of them look good, but I gotta believe that that 6.3 might be a hair sharper. Now, let's go back to 100%. That's the 400 millimeter with teleconverter. Here's the 800 6.3. Here's what I'll tell you. If we are scrutinizing images this close to figure out which one is just a hair sharper, we are probably focusing too much on technical detail, and we might want to just make sure we're considering the artistic values of photography at the same point, because none of these lenses that I have tested are significantly different than the others. So here's what I'll tell you. In terms of sharpness, I'm not going to go any further in terms of sharpness, but I am going to show you some real world pictures. In terms of sharpness, this lens is plenty sharp to take award-winning images for any contest you enter in the world, period. No one will ever say, wow, that lens looks a little soft. As long as the user is applying proper techniques and there's not motion blur involved in that image. But as long as you're using proper techniques, you're going to get a great image out of this lens every single time. So we've talked about a quick overview of the lens, kind of how it's built, a professional build. I mean, it's just a great build on this. We showed you the sharpness difference, and I think I made the point. Absolutely plenty sharp. Every review I've read on this lens says no issues with sharpness. By the way, if you were to look at one of those charts to tell you where is this lens sharpest, it will tell you at f8 it's actually the sharpest for this specific lens, but at 6.3 it's very little difference. So one of the nice things is you have the ability to shoot this what we would call wide open, so at its largest aperture, 6.3, and you're still getting sharp images. Now, take it out in the field. I will tell you this, I took this out so many times, I had such trouble getting birds. Now it's November here when I did these reviews, late October, early November. I recorded this video end of November, and there weren't a lot of birds around. And I was hoping for raptors. I'll get to this a little bit in terms of who this is for, but I wanted to photograph birds in flight. If I had done it again, maybe I would have tried to get this lens a little earlier during hawk migration. I had a really bad year with hawks, so I don't know that it would have made that much of a difference. I did get some bird in flight, but nothing that I will show you today. It tracked the birds fine. I had no issues with tracking with it, but I had about 8 images and they were all of birds flying away, and I just can't show you that. But what I can show you is a few songbirds. I was lucky. I just took it out hand holding it. And I took it out into the woods, and I'm going to show you some raw files. These are just unedited, straight out of camera. This is kind of the look I got. So here's the first one. This is a song sparrow just perched in a tree. He was about 20 feet away. One of the neat things about this, maybe a little more than 20 feet, is when you look at proportions. These song sparrows are small birds. When you look at proportions, this is a really nice proportion. There's just enough room to crop for composition. And when we look at sharpness, I'll zoom it in. you can see without any additional sharpening or anything being done to this, there's still really, really good detail on an overcast day. Now, let me go to one more image. This is a ruby-crowned kinglet. This is one of the smallest songbirds we photograph in North America. A tiny, tiny little bird. Look at the proportion. Look at how large the bird is in the frame. This is just about perfect, by the way. This is closer to 18 feet, kind of that minimum focus area. But this is a great proportion. It gives us just enough room to crop, and I could still get a lot of detail if that's what I'm looking for. Of course, I could always be farther away and get a more environmental shot, but for somebody looking for maybe a little bit more detail on the bird, this is a great example. Now, to highlight that, on this day, I took one image and I actually went ahead and edited it. And this is what it looked like. Now, this image that I've got up on the screen right now is a ruby-crowned kinglet. Again, it's that same bird, but I got a much better perch this time. So you saw that last one was pretty sticky and not something I would ever edit and post. This one came out quite nice, and you can see the proportions are good. A modest crop on this, so I only cropped it about 20%. I did a small digital manipulation. I had a little leaf in the top left corner. I digitally removed that. I try to make sure people know that if I digitally remove something or in my photos, I will tell you I always have the approach that I try to photograph birds as art. So I'm okay with digitally manipulating small things as long as the scene is true to what it was. And I can promise you this is exactly what I saw with my eye outside of that little leaf. Now, in this image, a lot of people are going to say, what about sharpness again? Like, let's get back to sharpness. Let me pull up a little bit of a detail here. And what you see on the opposite side now is two versions. There's the top version. This is straight out of camera with some small exposure manipulation. So a little bit of hue, saturation, and exposure. No sharpening in the top image. That's out of camera without those small adjustments. In the bottom image, I did my normal processing, which is to use Topaz Photo AI. And when I did that, I added just a little sharpening. Now, I will say this. I love Topaz products. I'll put a link down at the bottom. I just got to tell you, they work every time. And you can see it's subtle. I don't want people to think of some of these third-party softwares or these photoshopping applications as cheating. This is just a small enhancement of what is there, a little noise reduction and a little sharpening. Be careful when using these sliders. I see some people get carried away and they want to hyper detail the bird and the feathers, and sometimes that does not look natural. It does not look good. And when it's compressed, it will even look worse. So just kind of a warning there. This lens is plenty sharp though. See that top image again? Plenty sharp in real life. Down at the bottom, just a hair of sharpening and a little noise reduction. That's the final image. And so I was real pleased with this. I did not think this lens was going to be like a songbird lens. And part of the reason is I'm used to shooting songbirds between 10 and 14 feet. That is my sweet spot for songbirds. That is at 560 millimeters. So I thought, 16 feet minimum focus. That's going to be tough for songbirds. Yet I captured one of the smallest songbirds we photographed with good detail in minimal crop in great, just really great environment. Like a lot of compression, so separation between the bird and the background was really good. And one of the advantages of this, I'll talk about it a little bit more later, is at 6.3 and 16 feet away, you get a wider depth of field. And what that will sometimes do is give you the bird completely in focus. So even this small bird, even though it's larger in frame, I get good separation with the background, but I also get the bird in focus because the depth of field isn't too shallow. So something to think about with that. Now, I've got pros and cons coming up at the end of this one, and I've got really the most important thing, which is who is this lens for? But let me show you a few more images. I took it out again on another day. I mentioned I didn't get birds in flight with this. I'm so upset. I do have limited time on these rentals. So again, thank you B&H, thank you Abe Kurland. I really appreciate you giving me this lens. But let me show you a few more images. I went out to a field with some sparrows. What I had hoped for was harriers in flight. Wanted to try to get some birds in flight for this video. Let me show you the first one. This is just a savanna sparrow perched on some kind of dead goldenrod. It was feeding on the seeds here. Mountains in the background, pretty scene. And I wanted to show that you can go a little smaller in frame, still get some scenery in there. So at 800 millimeters, it doesn't mean everything's going to be a tight shot like I had with that kinglet. I'll show you a couple more, a variety of light on here. By the way, very low light on these. And this was my fear with this lens, is at 6.3, and I'm used to shooting f4, what's it gonna be like early in the morning? I'll put the settings up here so you'll see kind of where that shutter speed is. It's dropping down. You'll see the noise level kind of getting a little higher, especially early morning. All of these treated, by the way, with that Topaz Photo AI software. So all of that noise reduction has already taken place on these. These are kind of the finished versions. Here's another one. This is another Savannah Sparrow, now a little closer. This was around, I would guess, 22 feet away. Pre-dawn, or not pre-dawn, but early dawn. You could see the light, very side-lit. I like this image. And notice the out of focus elements. Because the length, the focal length is so great, there is a lot of compression taking place. And I don't want to make this video all about technical stuff, but relatively speaking, an 800 millimeter lens at 6.3 offers a lot of compression. So you will get pretty good background separation, and you can see that. In my head, I didn't think an 800 millimeter lens would have that, but it did. I have another example coming up, so I want you to stay tuned that talks a little bit more about that practical example. Here's another Savannah Sparrow, just again, environmental shot with his mouth open feeding, and I've got one more little songbird. This has some foreground blur in it. I know this is not everybody's cup of tea, but I liked this one. Half of his head is actually in blur, but the light side is not. It was interesting to me, and I loved the perch. I like showing birds in habitat. So if you follow my channel, my actual photography stuff, this is a style that I really, really like. It's not for everybody, and I get that as well. So those are some of the images that I had out in the field. Didn't get birds in flight, but maybe I'll get this lens back one day. By the way, I have to give this up today. I'm not looking forward to it because I really, really was interested in shooting this one a little bit more. Now, while this video is specifically about the lens, more or less who it's for and pros or cons, there is one subject I wanted to deal with since I had this direct comparison. And it's looking at the 800 millimeter at 16 feet and then looking at the 400 millimeter at 8 feet. And when you do that, you get about the same size in the frame of the subject. But I want to show you what happens to the background. So two things happen. One, the 400 goes all the way down to 2.8. So if I shoot that wide open and I get closer, I'm going to get a narrower depth of field. Now, there are depth of field calculators out there that will talk about this, and I've got a video coming up on this. But for now, I just need you to understand, as you open the aperture up, your depth of field will get shallower, meaning less of the subject is in focus. You will also get more of the background out of focus. Distance also affects that formula. So what I did, I put a bird, I'll put it up on the screen now. I took this bird and I put it in one spot, and it did not move. So that little, you see that little dead flower back there from my native plant garden. All of these plants are starting to die out here this time of year. And then I started at 16 feet, and then I went to 8 feet. And when I did that, I shot at 400, but I also opened it up all the way. So this is the image you're looking at now. This is 800 millimeters at its widest open setting of 6.3. Now watch how close the bird is in terms of the scale, so the size in the frame. That's the 800, and there's the 400. Now I had to move my tripod, so I didn't quite compose it exactly the same. But notice, I'll go back one more time. There's two things you're going to notice. The size of the subject relative to the frame is about the same, which you would expect. I'm twice as close, but I've got half the focal length, so it should be about the same. Now watch the flower in the background. That didn't change. The subject from the distance from the subject to that dead flower is about 6 inches. As you get closer, notice how out of focus it becomes. Nothing else changed. All I did was take the new lens, open it up as wide as I could, and get closer. The advantage to somebody shooting this style is that you will get a more blurred effect in the background. So you're closer with a wider aperture. And keep in mind, it's going to cost you about $8,000 more to get this lens to do that. You would have a similar effect if you shot a 600 millimeter f4 lens at its minimum aperture. It would be close. So it's kind of different strokes for different folks. I showed you that at its minimum focus distance, you get some nice background separation, but it won't be the same as getting really close with a lens that opens up more, even if it has a shorter focal distance. Again, I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that. I'll go back and forth and show you one more time, but I do think it's pertinent because when people say, well, why am I going to spend so much more money for a 600 f4 or a 400 2.8? Well, when you can shoot, and again, it's a big caveat on this is when you can shoot at the closer ranges, you'll get a narrower depth of field, which will create a more out of focus background, if that's what you like. The other side of that is the depth of field on the subject will also be narrower, which means more chances for mistakes, and you may not get the whole subject in focus if that's what your goal is. So I thought that was an interesting comparison, kind of a bonus content for this video. And now I'm gonna kind of wrap up this lens and what I feel about it after using it for a month. Let's kind of start with the pros on this one. It's pretty easy. It's really sharp. It's really nice. Good build quality. So components are really nice. Good options here in terms of functionability and programmability, just like all the Nikon lenses. It may sound odd to say a $6,000 lens is a great value, but remember what we're comparing it to. Its predecessor is still over $16,000. The value on this is really, really impressive. You're likely to get your subject in focus, so you're likely to get the whole subject with that depth of field we talked about before. And the weight ratio, the amount of weight for the lens that you get, so the focal length, 800 millimeters for 5 pounds is just, it's actually incredible considering the old lenses in this focal range were 10 pounds. By the way, Sony and Canon also make 800 millimeter lenses. That Canon lens, if I'm not mistaken, is still over $15,000. So just a tremendous value in terms of what this is. So let's talk real quickly about the cons. There aren't that many. Number one, probably the biggest one for me, at 6.3, regardless of the length of the lens, 6.3 is 6.3 aperture, and it doesn't give you as much light in your image, which means in pre-dawn, the first light of the day, heavy overcast conditions, your shutter speeds are going to come down and your noise is going to go up compared to some of those more expensive prime lenses. So that's probably the biggest downfall for me, is just the aperture in general. You may not get the same kind of buttery smooth background or bokeh from this lens as you might in some of the more expensive lenses, but I showed you the examples and I was actually pretty pleased with it, so I don't have a huge problem there, but compared to the others, maybe not quite as much. Minimum focus distance. Now this is probably for me the deal breaker on this lens. I typically shoot my songbirds at somewhere between 8 and 14 feet, which means the sweet spot for me, I can't use this. In fact, there were times when I was shooting that kinglet that I showed you that he came inside of the 16 feet. I couldn't shoot him. I wouldn't have that problem with my lens. Even if I put a teleconverter on my lens, I gain some of that reach. I get that reach back, but I never lose minimum focus with teleconverters. And that's really one of the strengths of teleconverters. So something to think about there in terms of minimum focus. So if you're shooting a lot close subjects, this can't be the lens for you. It just can't be. So who is this lens for? Well, I think best use for this is action. Environments where you've got good light, you're going to try to freeze action. This could be birds fishing or eagles fighting, or maybe you've got some kind of wildlife that you're photographing where there's a lot of movement, which requires a lot of available light. So if you're shooting in stronger light, this lens, the drawbacks of shooting in low light, you don't have to worry about. You get all of that extra reach. Weight is really, really good on this one. So it's a really great lens. And for me specifically as a bird photographer, if I focused mostly on birds in flight, there's almost no doubt this would be my go-to lens. If I was shooting birds in flight for a day and I had to choose any of Nikon's lenses in their lineup, right now this would probably be the one, especially given the cost. At $6,000 compared to $14,000 or $15,000, it's just really, really, really great value. And birds in flight for me would be the #1 application for this. And for those shooters who aren't getting close ever, if you find that you're always 15 feet away or 16 feet away from your subjects, there's really not much of a downside to this lens. And so definitely consider it if you're one of those people who just typically is further away. Now, could you use this for larger subjects? Well, sure. If you're shooting off of a tripod and you're shooting moose or elk or other wildlife like that, it could be a very, very good lens to use. Even in low light, when you're on a tripod, that's going to get mitigated. The subjects are further away, so movement is kind of mitigated. So it probably has a practical application there. If it was my only wildlife lens, if you said, Scott, in any range of Nikon's lenses, which would you choose as a bird photographer? This would probably not be my first option, and that's because I do like that closer, kind of like, again, 8 to 14 feet for me is like a great distance for these smaller birds. So it wouldn't be my first choice. But again, if I was a bird in flight photographer, I would tell you like 100%, this would be the lens. I hope you enjoyed this video on the 800mm lens by Nikon. I hope you found those practical examples helpful. I really personally like that, so I'm hoping you found it helpful, kind of showing you some of the comparison and just out in the field what this lens looks like. If you have any questions about this lens, go down in the comments and let me know specifically what your questions are and if you found this helpful. But if you own the lens, I'd really love to hear from you. What do you think about it? What are you struggling with? What do you find the pros and cons to be? And is my use case, like, who is this for? Did I get it right on this one? I kind of think I did. I really had a blast shooting with this lens. I'll actually be packing it up and sending it back to B&H today, but I'm looking forward to getting another rental and trying out another lens for you and giving you some more practical examples. But until that time, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.